Welcome to the RSM Live, the Royal Society of Medicine's online platform. And this is an episode on the Forensic Practice and Digital Technology series. My name is Ruhi Patel, and I'm pleased to introduce two speakers for this evening's webinar. Mr. Mark Stokes is Director and CTO of Engineering and Forensic Sciences Limited, and Professor Felipe Tomás, a professor at Said Business School, University of Oxford. Questions from the audience will be posed at the end of each of the webinars. Please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screens to submit a question. Audience members can upvote a question they wish to be posed by clicking the thumbs up button next to the questions. You can also join the conversation online using hashtag RSM Live. Now for the episode. The first talk is by Mark, entitled From Fingerprints to Mobile Phones, a story from traditional forensics to the world of digital forensics. Mark will outline for us how forensic evidence has grown from traditional forensic trace evidence through to encompassing the digital age of now and beyond. He will give us a flavour of the growing challenges that we are facing and some of the solutions that we can consider. Over to you, Mark.
Thanks, Ray. Welcome, everybody. Oops, what happened? Hi, welcome everybody. So yes, I've started my career in forensic science as an engineer. There's only 2 engineers in our laboratory back in the 80s, and it's been an interesting career. First 10 years was in research and development and developing instrumentation within forensic science laboratory. And then computers got smaller and were available on desks. And then criminals decided that these were great things to get into and could be used to commit crimes or could be used to forge documents and generally be used as tools within a criminal context. I'm going to go through today, as Rui said, a bit about the traditional forensics background, a little bit of the history, but then we're going to go straight into the digital forensics, how that progressed from small desktop computers, mobile phones, a bit around storage, and then really a bit about the future at the end, which is around quantum computing. So really, forensics really started with fingerprints and something called Lockhart's principle, and this phrase, every contact leaves a trace. And there's some text there around Dr. Edmund Lockhart wrote around leaving footprints, hair, fibers from clothes at scenes of crime. Little did he know really that this was going to equally apply to the world of digital forensics, that we leave huge traces every day, that we use our mobile phones, send text messages, make calls. I would say when we're out and about, but most of us are locked in our homes at COVID, so we know where we mostly are. But in a field that I spent many years reporting on in court was something called cell site analysis, and I'll talk a bit about that as well as we go through this. So a little bit about traditional forensic science, as I say, and the background. We really, back in the sort of 70s, 80s, we were still using a lot of glass trace analysis. We even used paint. If you see the fragment there of paint, you can see there's actually layers of colored paint there. And we could match paint from vehicles that were in accidents back to a suspect vehicle if it was found, and link that vehicle to a scene of crime using a bit like archaeology. The layers of paint go through and they're different. Today, vehicles are a lot less boring and we don't really use paint in forensic science as a trace evidence. And also glass, it used to be turn up in people's pockets and turn ups of their trousers when they broke windows. But again, glass is not really used. And then we go through to I think it was early 90s really that we started to look at using DNA and DNA is now, along with fingerprints, are two of the major areas of use in forensic science. We don't really do, we do some shoe marks, but not that much anymore. We used to do something around blood typing a while back, but again, with DNA, that's no longer used. And tool marks, where you got small marks and lines which were unique to a tool. So if you found a suspect with a tool, you could match that back to the marks left by taking a mold of the marks at a scene of crime. Fibers still used occasionally, but again, not great evidence, but can be used and can be unique within a batch of clothing or something in terms of color and those sorts of things. And then really what we're going to be talking about tonight is computers and mobile phones, and something we've termed over the years digital forensics. Really came along around about 1995, when computers were small enough to sit on someone's desks, and we started to have big analog phones, if you're old enough to remember big old analog mobile phones that people carried around. So digital forensics really is about computers. What is a computer? Some of you may have taken your desktop and home computer apart. Some people may have added memory to that computer or graphics cards and things. But most of us today really are users of computers without actually really delving inside of them. Most of us use tablets or laptops, and you can't easily get inside of those. So we're not really aware of what's going on. In essence, they're big calculators. They process numbers. In terms of most digital computers, that's ones and zeros, adding them up, subtracting, moving them around, storing them in memory, and those sorts of things. As you can see on the screen there, you have a processor which does that calculation, moving numbers, storing numbers. You have a main memory where we store that information, maybe a program, maybe a bit of code that operates the computer when you start it up. We will have an input device, which will be a lot of the time a keyboard or something like that, or a sensor. And then we'll have an output device, which could be a screen or something like that, maybe a display of numbers or something separately. But the majority of the time, it's a screen of some sort showing some information or data. What we'll look at today, and the most important part in digital forensics really, is the memory within the system, and we'll talk a bit about the different types of memory you get in a computer. Something called RAM, which is a volatile RAM, and as I said before, some of you may have upgraded your RAM in your computer, and this sort of memory loses its data once the computer is turned off. In digital forensics, the most interesting parts of the memory are what we call non-volatile memory, i.e. when the power is turned off and data is stored on disks, or more today, solid state, small chips that will contain that data for sometimes 10 to 20 years, stored with no power attached. And we're going to look at how we might recover some of that data, even when those chips are damaged, and go through some of the forensic processes. So some of us may remember the old Nokia mobile phones, very simple mobile phones. But in essence, it's a computer. It's got a memory in it. It has a program in it, an operating system. It's a dedicated operating system in terms of a mobile phone. You can't easily upgrade it. And in early mobile phones, you couldn't add any applications to the device. However, in a phone like the Nokia mobile phone here, you could recover last numbers dialed. It would have a smart card inside it, a SIM card that would also store data that could be recovered. Smart cards are very similar to bank cards on the right. And again, those bank cards and smart cards are like small computers. They hold their own memory, their own RAM, and they have an input and output, and they connect to the real world, either to your mobile phone in terms of a SIM card, or it could be a bank card when you put it into the machine to transact within a shop or premises. Again, all leave traces behind. And then in early 90s, as I said, we came along with these types of computers, IBM computers sitting on the desk, this one with floppy disks in it. And we're going to take a look at some of the storage devices historically that were about and how that's moved on today and how it's very different in terms of the volume of data in a very short period of time. And data is one of the main challenges and the sheer volume of data that is generated today, both within smartphones, tablets, vehicles, and something called the Internet of Things that we'll have a look at as well, and different devices connected to the internet that store data, share data, time and date movement and events, CCTV, things like that. We come back to the smartphone now, which is really your iPhone, which is very much similar to a computer today. It's really just a small tablet. You can add applications to it. You can even write documents on it if you can type that well on a small device of that size. And you can do everything on there in principle that you could do on a computer system. And all of that leaves those traces. Every contact leaves a trace, and there'll be a digital trail of what you've stored on that device. Even when that device is damaged, that data could be recovered from the mobile phone or computer. So storage. This is one of the biggest growth demands, and the sheer volume of data that you get now stored in digital systems, whether that be the devices you're carrying around in your pocket, your mobile phone, your tablet, or the computer on your desk, but more and more today held in the cloud, terabytes of data. But just rolling back a little bit, looking at some of the history of this, we had what we call Winchester drives, big magnetic drives that store data. And we were talking about kilobytes of data, about a page of A4 typed text on something of this size. And then we go forward and we have something called floppy disks. Again, if you're of an age and a generation, you might remember using these. You've got an 8-inch floppy disk, 5 1/4 and a 3.5-inch floppy disk, but containing relatively small amounts of data. 1 or 2 documents could be stored on these. Images weren't really a thing being stored in those days. And then we move along into hard drives, which today, hard drive like this can hold 4 terabytes of data, huge numbers of images, and we generate masses of images and video on a daily basis across the world. We're also storing now more and more, as I said, on solid state devices, little chips like this. Some of us will have in our pockets and carry around documents and information on thumb drives, USB thumb drives. And that data is stored in these little chips, and again, can go up to terabytes of data now in a small chip. A terabyte of data on a small storage device like a thumb drive is quite expensive at the moment, but gigabytes of data stored on these thumb drives, the cost of that storage and memory is very cheap indeed. Sometimes when you go to conferences and things, people are even giving them away. They're so cheap these days. One of the things we'll look at in a minute is how we might recover data from the chips when they're damaged. You can see in this image here, inside that black outer coating of these chips is a little piece of silicon which stores data, and then there are silver or gold wires that come off and connect that chip to the outside world. These wires can get damaged, and sometimes the silicon can get damaged, and we have techniques which I'll describe that allow us to recover that data from those devices when they're damaged. So mobile phones that are damaged, the chips themselves can be damaged and data can be recovered from them. There are some complexities now with encryption that we'll touch upon as well. We're getting to the point now in data storage where within 2 years, 90% of online data has been produced in the past 2 years. That's quite something to get your head around. That's online video, social media networks, audio, all of that being stored and spun around the world on computers, landing in the cloud and being stored. And you can imagine the challenge in the digital forensics world as we try and recover data from physical devices, but as well from the cloud. Recently, they've been looking at storing, actually it crosses over with where we were in traditional forensics, can actually store data, binary data onto DNA. It's quite tricky to store. It's even slower to recover from DNA, but the potential to archive large amounts of data onto DNA is there, and it will probably get used more and more as that technology advances to store data on small strands of DNA. A spoonful of DNA could actually hold the majority of the data in the world today. So where we've come today is computers are becoming almost ubiquitous. We started back in 1980s with small home computers like the BBC Micro here, and it became very much affordable and really sparked the growth of computing, people learning to program and understand how computers work, and really drove the growth of the computer industry. And then obviously crime follows that. And people, as I say, were using computers to commit crimes as they became more popular within offices. Banking went online using more and more computing technologies, and we would recovering data from hard drives and storage within those systems as people use them to commit crimes or facilitate crimes. A small computer here called a Raspberry Pi, just to give you some idea of how cheap and ubiquitous this computing is becoming. These sort of small computers now you can buy actually for £5, and you can program this computer. You can actually connect it to a keyboard and a screen, and you can actually have office programs and word processors running on something for the cost of £5. In fact, the keyboard will probably cost you more than the computer these days. They're giving them away in schools with little BBC micro bits, which children can then learn to connect these to the outside world, these little pads, and use them and program them to control devices. So it gives children the ability to learn quite quickly around computers and programming. And even very young children now can use like almost like a Lego, where you can build a program flow on the computer. So really cheap computing, very flexible and easy to use. You don't have to be an engineer or computer programmer to use these devices anymore. And we all upload applications and leave these traces of data every day as we go about our business. So touching on that sort of traces and what I call the digital fingerprint, we're now talking about CCTV, mobile phones when we go and transact in shops using cash machine and payments. Whenever you're walking around with your mobile phone, it connects to cell masts, and I'll go into that a little later around how we can use the cell masts and the connection between your mobile phone to locate your mobile phone within a given area. Vehicles today, the majority of vehicles, certainly post 2006, are full of computers. The majority of new vehicles come out with screens on them. You don't have a traditional radio, and we have infotainment systems, as we call them, that you can play your music through. You can use the GPS to navigate. All of this data, speed, distance, routes, even the time and date headlights are turned on and off, and power is connected and disconnected to a computer, can be stored in the memory of a vehicle. And again, even if the vehicles are damaged by fire or something, we can recover that data. Many, many devices becoming ubiquitous in our homes as well. Even as we see here, fridges, Alexas, Google devices, we can talk to them, all again leaving traces of what we're doing, where we've been. Some of this data, as I say, is on the physical device, but more and more that data is being left on a cloud. And that gives challenges because that data may not even be in the United Kingdom. And legally, our laws and everything sit around how we access data on physical devices in the digital forensics world, and those storage mediums within the legal boundary of the United Kingdom. And when that data is stored outside the United Kingdom, that can be more difficult. But again, fridges with screens in, I haven't seen very many of these in my career, but if you've got the money, you can afford one of these, and you can have a computer in your fridge, and you can even push a button and it'll show you what's inside your fridge on your mobile phone when you're out. So if you've not sure what you've got left in your fridge, you can have a look inside your fridge and see what's in there with a special camera that doesn't mist up in your fridge. Very expensive, and as I say, not really seen in digital forensics at the moment, but again, technology becomes cheaper. Maybe that's something that becomes more and more common in the home. Drones certainly are becoming more and more common, and they're used to drop contraband into prisons. And again, we can analyze these drones. They have GPS units in them, they have cameras in them, and memory cards. And we've actually seen drones and recovered data from drones where criminals have tested the drone before they've flown it to a prison, filming themselves, filming the number of the door where they live and the number plate of the car outside their house in nice super 4K video, and then think they've deleted the data in the camera, but they haven't, and it's still there and recoverable, identifying them later once the drone was recovered from outside a prison. We've even got doorbells now. Some of you may have these, where you can be in the office, someone can want to deliver a parcel or visit your home, and you can answer the door. And if you've got a fancy electronic door lock, you could even let that person in if they're known to you and you want them to be able to enter your home. These devices, again, can store video. That video may be stored on your mobile phone. It may be stored in the device itself. Or more likely, it might be stored remotely on the cloud again. Though we have done some data recovery from doorbells where the memory inside the doorbell contained in one case about 26 images, and actually identified the suspect of a murder inquiry where he caught the light to a flat. So it depends on the type of device where that data might be stored. So vehicles, we touched upon that earlier, or I touched upon that earlier. They are just full of computers today. There'll be 2 or 3 separate computers in a vehicle. One will be very dedicated to controlling your engine, because you don't want that to go wrong. And the majority of cars today, when you push the accelerator pedal or even the brake pedal, you're not actually directly controlling your vehicle. That will go through a very fast computer that responds a bit like an aircraft that's fly-by-wire. It's literally signals going down cables, operating parts of your car. Cars have safety systems today where they can even keep you in the lane. They can turn the steering wheel themselves. They can apply brakes and safety systems themselves, all being done by small computers. Again, a lot of this data can be recovered, and these computers are talking to each other, and data can be stored between the different computers on the vehicle, and we can recover that data. And as I said earlier, it could be even telling you the geolocation, the latitude and longitude, where you are on a map, when you opened the doors of your car, when you sat in the seat in your car, what speed you were doing when you're driving along. So not just simply GPS data and things like that, a whole wealth of data. Seat belts, when they were plugged in, were you wearing a seatbelt or not? Some cars can even measure the weight of the people sitting in the seats. Don't know why you need that, but maybe it's to change some settings or something. So what I thought I'd look at also is some niche areas of digital forensics that don't really come to mind outside of sort of storage of data and computers. Something called electrical network frequency analysis. This one takes a little bit of getting your head around, but in essence, any digital device that makes an audio recording can have induced in that audio recording the electromagnetic radiation from the electrical wiring or electrical poles, any mains electricity system that is creating an electromagnetic field can radiate and be recorded in the digital system. Most of our devices have microphones in it. It's not coming through the actual microphone as an audio signal. It's actually being induced in a little coil in the microphone, and then that gets embedded in the recording signal. You never hear this 50 hertz, 50 cycles a second hum. If you've ever put an old-fashioned analog radio near the mains, you will hear this hum, 50 hertz hum noise. Now, in electrical network frequency analysis, this hum actually slightly changes frequency depending on the load of the network. And this is the same throughout the country. It's the same variation, but it's like a small little fingerprint, which is unique to a period of time. And you can see this changes in frequency. So here's 50 hertz, the center of the frequency, this hum, and then it can go down to around about 49.8 hertz and up to about 50.2. Just very small changes in frequency in time. And this period across here would be about 5 seconds. This variation is unique and has been found and proven to be unique to a period in time. We can record this change in frequency and store this in a database. And then we can use that database to match the variation of the signal, authenticating the time and date of an actual recording. Because on digital devices, you can change the time and date, and there we can't always rely on the time and date given in a system of an audio recording. It can also show a discontinuity if this is not fluid change. If there's a sudden jump or skip, we can see if an audio recording has been edited by someone as well. Quite a difficult technique to get your head around, and I'm sure there'll be a few questions on that one towards the end. Another digital fingerprint trace is going around with your mobile phone. If you've ever looked up at the top of buildings, you'll see these white aerials. And these are the masts that connect the signal to your mobile phone, allowing you to make and receive calls. The interesting thing about these masts, they form what is called a cell. It's called a cell because it just covers a small area, and you need a huge number of these masts that make up these cells to cover a particular area. These masts and cell transmit radio waves. Those radio waves only cover, as I say, a certain area within a cell. They overlap to another cell, so when you move around, your call will transfer seamlessly. Sometimes you'll find it doesn't, and the call will drop, especially if you're driving and using a mobile phone, hopefully hands-free, otherwise committing an offense. You'll drop a call because it's trying to connect between one mast and another and loses signal in between. But in essence, they cover a small area. Each mast has a unique identity, and that identity is recorded every time a call is made or received, or you send or receive a text messages. That data is not recorded through just walking around with your mobile phone. So when we apply for a call record for someone, all we will get is the data of a call that is made and received. Obviously, it's police officers that have to apply for that legally, that data, and there's a whole legal process to obtain that data, and you have to have the right, necessity and proportionality to access that data relating to a particular crime that the police are investigating. They will then hand that data over to us. We will then analyze that data. We can get the physical location of these masts, and we can plot an area that a mobile phone has been in. I hasten to add, we can't put it into a precise location like GPS data from a GPS system on a phone or a GPS system in a car, but it gives a relatively small geographical area that the mobile phone was in at the time the call was made or a text message received. It can be anything in a town from 200 meters in a very busy area to 3 kilometers in a more urban, spaced out area where there's less people. So rough rule of thumb is the more people you expect to be in an area, the smaller this coverage of these masts will be, and the smaller area you can put a mobile phone or device into. It doesn't have to be a mobile phone. It can obviously be a computer or some other mobile device that uses a SIM card inside of it. Another interesting digital forensics technique, it's not used that much, but it's been used in a few cases over time, is something called photo response non-uniformity, PRNU. And this relies again on sort of noise and, but noise within a sensor. If you can imagine your mobile phone camera, for instance, this is true for any digital camera. Here is the lens of the camera. Inside here is a small chip that the light goes onto, and that chip reacts to the level of light. And in this drawing, we're representing little pixels that the light falls on. Obviously, this is very much zoomed in. There'd be millions of pixels, just like the sensor on the left here. We've got millions and millions of pixels. Because they're so fine, you get the refraction here and the color changes across the sensor, but this is a camera sensor blown up, which is behind that lens. The light falls on these pixels, but due to manufacturing tolerances, the level of the light will slightly fluctuate depending on the way in which the chip was produced. And each pixel will have a slightly different way it reacts to the light. And we can sort of what we call baseline this level. So if we take a picture of a completely white surface, you will see that the pixels have noise in them. And this noise, this response, individual response to the light is unique and separate for every single sensor produced in a camera. How you say, is that useful? Well, that's useful because regardless of how the images are processed, what has been found is that that noise is retained within the image. So here is a picture of a gun. And if we could magically take away all the color from this picture, and that's what you actually do in this technique, you would see that there is a noisy, speckly background behind this that you can't see, but it's there. We can then take a number of images on a suspect device. So if we wanted to link some images on the internet and say they were taken by this device, or we find some images stored on someone's computer and want to prove that they're stored on someone's were taken on someone's digital camera, then we can prove by taking a series of test images and linking them to the stored images that's been recovered from the internet or someone's physical device. We can actually match them up by subtracting this noise from the images, comparing it to the test images on the camera, and we can give a coefficient of match. So it's a 90% match to that sensor that these images were taken using that digital camera or device. Normally we need about 5 images to be taken on the actual digital camera itself to actually get a good representative sample of the signal noise in the sensor, and then we can match them to the images that we're looking to link across to that device. Just a little bit on the what I call the dark side, the dark web. It's something you've probably all heard about, and not going to go into this too much, but basically we use something called the onion router Tor. It requires lots of computers to talk to each other with software running on someone's computer at home. And it's a way that criminals will use to hide their IP address, that identity that links their computer or router to them, to a physical location. Criminals use it to access credit card details, drugs, indecent images of children, all sorts of things. It's actually quite slow because it goes through all these different computer systems, and it's been quite hard to navigate and find information unless you know from some source that where you need to go, or you're very familiar with that part of the web, really. Quite hard to get into, and you need special browsers to go through it and get into it. So a little bit about the digital forensic process itself. How do we recover the data? We've seen some of these techniques we can use. Where do we get the images from? I talked about damaged devices, and even if phones are burnt, vehicles are burnt, computers have been damaged or burnt, we can recover the chips, the hard drives from those devices and recover that data. Less and less computers today actually have physical hard drives in them, most people's laptops. And as we move to tablets and more mobile phones, certainly tablets will not have hard drives in, and mobile phones won't. They have these small chips storing the data like this. And that small chip is a piece of silicon that stores all the data. Gigabytes up to terabytes of data can be stored. You can get mobile phones now with 256 gigabytes of data storage in them, which is a lot of images and a lot of data to go through forensically. But as I said before, even if these the phones themselves are damaged, or the chips themselves are damaged by fire, then it can be potentially possible to recover the data. If those gold and silver bomb wires that connect to these pads are damaged, then we can use a device like this, little probe station, very tiny needles that can then go onto these little pads here and recover data. We can even go onto the pins here and tracks and recover segments of data as well. If the chips are in one piece, but the physical phone or tablet or laptop is damaged, we can recover the chips, take the chips out. We can put them in a reader like this and forensically read the data. And when we say forensically read the data, we're talking about protecting the devices so we can only read the data and we don't make any changes to the data. And it's the same with hard drives. We would use something called a write blocker, so we can only read the information. And when we forensically make a copy of the data from the hard drive, we're not changing any of the data on the hard drive. This is called a physical write blocker. You can do it in software, but a lot of forensic practitioners prefer a physical device that stops you writing data back to the device. We will make a copy of the data. So whether it's a chip or a hard drive, we'll make a complete copy. We'll normally make 2 copies of the data, a working copy and something called a court copy that we'll store away, and that can be examined by the defense or anyone else. These are normally digitally signed with a signature, so you can actually prove that no changes have been made to that data when it was recovered from those devices, whether that's the chip or the physical hard drive. A lot of hard work then goes on actually analyzing that data, going through it. What are the points to prove? And as I said before, there's so much data now, you know, on a single computer, you can get terabytes of data. So within law enforcement, we ask officers to really focus down on what it is their investigation is looking for and to focus in on what is the evidence they're trying to find. Or if it's a defense case, what are we trying to say about that defense case and how we disprove the allegations. So we talked about the sheer volume of data and the storage and being able to remove chips and hard drives. One of the challenges today is privacy and security, and it's quite a complex issue. It's that balance between, you know, is this data going to be intercepted by someone? Is a virus going to land on my computer and send all my data to someone that's going to use it for criminal purposes? So you want all that data encrypted and password protected, but at the same time, you may want to use that data to prove that a crime has been committed and or murder, or you want to recover indecent images of children or something like that. And if all this data is encrypted, how do we then decrypt that. I'm not going to go into too much into some of the secrets here. Least to say, one of the weak links in all encryption is passwords, and you'll see there, this is absolute data from a website which has got the top 5 passwords most commonly used in the world. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Oh, added a few digits to that one. QWERTY, the first few letters of your keyboard, and the word password, believe it or not. And all of these are the top 5 passwords used. So we can use techniques that allow us to, without again saying too much, go through a series of tests around what passwords may have been used, and sometimes we can crack that encryption and get in it. But that is getting harder as people become aware not to use these types of simple passwords. I could bet some of us just use a word, a name or something, and then some numbers at the end, and then every time we're asked to change that password, we just increment the number at the end by 1. Therefore, that's not very difficult to crack and guess that password. But in mobile phones, where that encryption is linked to the chips inside the phone, the individual chips, it can become even harder to decrypt that data once it's encrypted. As I said before, cloud data stored outside the UK, then where's the legal powers to recover that data? If it's stored in the United States or somewhere else, it can be very hard to get that data back when it's stored outside the UK. So just to end with, this is a really complex area. I'm not going to go into too much, but quantum computing really is a branch of computing that will be the future. We can do something called quantum encryption, which will allow us to encrypt data and know if someone is trying to crack that encryption of that data. Because as soon as you try and decrypt it, you will see you disturb it, and you know that they're trying to crack that encryption. Quantum computing could eventually crack traditional encryption techniques. However, like all things, it's a bit like an arms race. I'm sure that the quantum computers will come along and we'll get more quantum encryption in the future. At the moment, quantum computing is really, it's early days, and I think it's going to be 10 or 15 years before we really see effective use of quantum computers in encrypting data on a regular basis in banks and things like that, and other places. One of the problems at the moment is that it's a bit like going back 30 or 40 years in computer terms. A quantum computer fills a room. The chips inside a quantum computer, the actual processor chip that holds the quantum states, needs to go down to a temperature of minus 273 degrees centigrade, and it can take literally 24 hours to stabilize a quantum computer. Least to say, quantum computers are just very, very fast computers. And I'm just going to end this evening with a short video just to put a bit of perspective on what the future might hold as we move into that quantum computing world.
Talk about quantum computing, it's a completely different game.
Quantum computing will enable us to solve problems that currently take longer than the lifetime of the universe in seconds, hours, or days.
We completely reconceive the space in which we do computation.
Quantum computing is like going from crawling to going to a different planet. It's different.
It's only natural that we would want to use the world's most powerful device to combat the world's most challenging problems.
We can attack global warming.
Security.
What are the boundaries of machine learning?
Fighting diseases. The possibilities of quantum computers are endless. Microsoft has the best and the brightest working on this problem.
It's really happening. Progress is very fast. And we're building a quantum computer.
What the world wants to know is what happens when we turn the machine on.
What problems will be solvable with a computer that computes in a billion parallel universes at the same time?
Must just add that other quantum computers are available, not just Microsoft. Google, others, and other companies have been set up just using, just to develop quantum computing. So, really, any questions now?
Thank you, Mark, for that. That was really interesting, taking everyday objects and having another perspective or slant on it. Remember, anyone can post questions. You just need to use your Q&A button at the bottom. From my perspective, I'm still sort of getting my head around the possibilities for quantum computing. And how far away are we from being able to access that sort of at the home, rather than, I can imagine that within security, at big organizations, etc., they will have access to quantum computing, you know, within half a decade.
You can access it today. There are IBM and others have applications where if you're so inclined, you can go on and you can start playing around with developing specific applications for quantum computing. It really is it's a whole area of science and computing in its own right, but it is available. It's quite niche, and it's not really at the level where, you know, it can't do the things in terms of applications that we would traditionally think of in traditional computing at the moment. It's quite niche and quite specialized.
I've seen it in sort of renewable energy, seems to be the but one place where I've come across it more rather than security. We have a question. Why is 2006 so different or special in terms of car data monitoring? Yeah, that's a good question.
Sorry, what was repeat the question again?
Why is, so you alluded to this within your talk, that cars now are collecting more data, almost like having a black box with your
yes.
with airplanes. And the question is, why
Absolutely.
is 2006 so different or special in terms of car data monitoring?
They started to put standards to the way in which data was stored in vehicles. And since about 2006, there's little ports on vehicles where you can connect to and recover the data from the vehicle a lot more easier. There were computers in cars before that, but they really weren't collecting a lot of data, and they were really dedicated to managing the engine rather than this whole world of what we commonly call today infotainment, entertainment systems, then linked to those computers, the rise of GPS systems within vehicles. Again, they were around, and, you know, top-end cars, but around 2006, they started to set some standards with these ports and say that they must have this ability that when you take a car into a garage, that the garage could connect up to this port and repair your car and analyze the data stored within it. So there's a whole industry that came out, and all cars since then do have this facility on them.
There's another one, which I think when you were alluding to signals, etc., one question is, are criminals using Wi-Fi hotspots to presumably gather data? What are the difficulties, and how do we avoid that from a practical sense?
If you're using your own computer, then in a practical sense, always make sure that it is a trusted Wi-Fi hotspot. Yes, you can set up what is commonly called a man-in-the-middle attack. So I could pretend to be McDonald's Wi-Fi and intercept your data. So you need to be really clear that you're logging on to their Wi-Fi. Always use secure hotspots where your data is encrypted when you log on. And again, use good passwords on your own systems, and make sure your data is encrypted at rest so people can't sort of get into your computer through those Wi-Fi hotspots and start looking at your data that you're transmitting or you're using on your computer. A lot of companies will insist you use what's called a virtual private network. So any data you send from your laptop when you're working remotely through Wi-Fi hotspots will absolutely be encrypted. If you're using a domestic computer, a lot of the time your data won't necessarily be encrypted when it travels across that Wi-Fi hotspot.
Okay. I'm really sorry because there are some other questions, but I'm aware of time.
Yes, I overran by about 5 minutes. I apologize.
So hopefully we'll have some time at the end, and we can, because there are some interesting, again, these are questions regarding how we can move forward and how we can protect our own data. So they're good questions to ask.
Yes.
But I will move on to our second speaker and come back to questions later, if that's okay. Our next speaker is Professor Felipe Thomas. Felipe led the marketing module of my MBA program, and I was fascinated by his specialist research. Applying the same marketing science that's used to improve the functioning of corporate networks to disrupt criminal networks and business forums in the dark web. Using his marketing lens, he will show us how these digital black markets have adapted to frustrate law enforcement and survive. He will also outline for us some of the tools and thinking used to undermine criminal exchange, which ultimately can de-resource these criminal organizations. Again, questions will be answered at the end of the talk, so please use the Q&A function to post them. Over to you, Felipe.
Thank you, Rui. I really appreciate it. And thank you for the invitation, and thank you for the other RSM members for the invitation to be here and talk about this stuff, but also to Mark that came ahead of me in discussion of this digital fingerprints. That's fairly dear and to my heart as well. And as he mentioned, there's this dark side of digital consumption and digital behaviors and hiding that's become a focus of my study. And at first it might seem weird to you that, like, why is a marketing person interested in this stuff at all? Like the first thing that might come to your mind is, I've watched Mad Men, that's marketing, right? Like that's all that you need to worry about. But modern marketing really has evolved into the use of all of this digital fingerprints that Mark discussed, but for the other benefits, right? The companies that are retaining and grabbing this information are using it for customer service. So a lot of my research actually is on that side of understanding all of the digital exchanges and points with consumers, collecting that data and building systems that give you more value, all the way to really crazy, insane future ideas like Amazon's predictive shopping, where they're going to just ship things to your house that they expect you want, and then you have the right of refusal at the door. So like, yeah, no, I didn't want this, and you can send it back. The systems are getting so good that we can understand what somebody might want, 2-3 days from now. And then the power of modern marketing really is, all of that knowledge all together from all of these services combining to having a really good idea of what individuals do. So I work with the likes of Google, Facebook, Twitter, like, all the big tech companies, Teradata, who manages the underlying backbone system for a lot of them, to really bring that to life. However, in the process of doing this, I came across and was collecting this data and doing some face checks. I ended up finding some pretty disturbing things. Amongst those was a communication in social media about human trafficking. And that kind of blew my mind, to be quite honest. I wasn't expecting it. I wasn't even thinking about it. And I had to come to terms with the idea that criminals were using these channels that I love and that pay attention to social media, et cetera, and setting up whole marketplaces, which is what I've devoted my life to understanding, in order to fund their criminal organizations. So I was simultaneously offended from a academic perspective of, you're messing with something that I love, with the human behavior of saying, okay, like as a person, I'm offended that you're doing this. And that's what set me on this path to understand. So today, I'm going to do a deeper dive into this consumption space that's relatively unique. I have the questionable honor of being the first person, the first marketing academic to look at this problem in this world and kind of lead the charge in this academic field. But the idea is, as Ruri described, is how do I use my theory, my understanding of consumption, demand, psychology, sociology, economics, to make sure that these things maybe don't exist into the future, right? Or how do I give access to law enforcement to these tools so they can do perhaps, so their jobs are perhaps a little easier. So I'll show you the dark web. Everything I'll show you is from dead websites, things that have closed, just because I have an ethical responsibility with the people that participate in these environments that they've moved on, since I am not law enforcement and I do not have that ability or charge to be able to actually see or interact with this world. So everything is really ethnographic and seeing it after they've moved on. So these are not active crime scenes, as it were, they're actually past crime scenes. And I'll show you what it looks like. I'll show you at least 2 different works that I've done on this area as to how they form, how they create, and why they do it this way, and what that means for actual normal law enforcement activity and investigations. And the general idea that I have is that a lot of this has evolved because of law enforcement, right? As a counter to how people investigate. If you have questions along the way for clarifications, go ahead, I'll keep an eye on Q&A. If you just want to hold on to bigger questions towards the end, that's fine as well. The only quick warning that I'll have is that I tried to remove as much of the upsetting content as I could, but 1 or 2 things might be triggering for some folks and issues. I know a lot of us here in the room are pretty desensitized to the dark sides of humanity, but just in case, there are some things that are slightly upsetting. And I'll go on to describe, what we see. I'll move quickly through it. So Mark just described this idea of criminals hiding, but I want to talk, like, what is this environment? Like, what is the point of the dark web, right? So if you think about all of the web, the entire internet, we generally divide it into 3 different spaces. One that we call the surface, everyday web that you search, you Google, or you Bing if you're one of those 2 people. And those are all the websites, things that you observe readily that are interconnected and indexed. So you put an address into Google and you're going to get that website back. Underneath that, you have the deep web. And the deep web is all the stuff that's hidden behind some walls, or let's say passwords, right? So if I was to enter your name and your bank account or your bank name into a search bar, you don't want me to access your bank account by doing that, right? Those things are not indexed. They exist, they're just in the deep, right? That's where they exist. They're hidden behind some layers of protection. The dark web is way beyond that. As was described, it is unindexed. So the addresses, the websites, the URLs require the specific browser in order to access Tor. It has to go through that process of the daisy chaining of signals. So it mixes and disorganizes individuals' IP addresses so they can't be traced as to where you came from, where you are. And finding where these markets are, you essentially have to be told where to go, right? It's not just discoverable in that sense. Now, being in the dark web doesn't make you a criminal immediately. Like Facebook has a dark web presence for people that are very private individuals, at least before they get onto Facebook and share all of their pictures. But WikiLeaks and New York Times, all of those exist in the dark web as a technology. It's quite valuable from a maintaining privacy perspective. It enables, like the Arab Spring, when governments wanted to shut down communication, people could still communicate via the dark web. So I don't want to make it an equation of this is bad and it's always bad. It just so happens that criminals are really good at finding really cool tools and saying, I'm going to make, some bad things with this. What comes with this is it's a little bit of a, US Wild West situation. It's very risky. There's some level of privacy, although they maintain the same names, same personas from time to time. And as you can imagine, there's no trust, right? Anybody tell you something, they're unlikely to take you at face value. You also have no protection, especially on a market and exchange. There's no such thing as contracts. You can't go to law enforcement if somebody steals your stuff. You're on your own and you have to watch your back. Now, it is a massive sort of market. Just in deviated and stolen pharmaceuticals, drugs, and I guess some fake ones as well, quite a few fake ones. It's about $200 billion a year in terms of sales. That goes to probably 900 to $1 trillion now in terms of total sales, if you consider all services and drugs and so on. That goes, essentially, it would be the 13th largest country in terms of GDP in the world, like just this shadow economy, growing at 600% over the past 3 years. The other issue then is people buying these pharmaceuticals in which might be prescription drugs they don't have access to, or they might be buying cheaper on the dark web. A lot of them are counterfeit and actually lead to fatalities. And just from that environment, there's a 2012 study that found that about 700,000 people died from taking the wrong medication that was purchased illegally via the dark web. The other thing to keep in mind that's going to play a role into our discussion today is that these markets are incredibly unstable. Even if you find that address and you show up there, they don't last very long. They collapse, they go away, and there's lots of reasons for this. But since the very first one, you might have heard the Silk Road, very initial dark market around 2013 that closed. They live for, there've been like over 190, probably closer to 200 today, because of a number of closures since January 6th. But the average lifetime, they don't last very long. They last about 8 months, which is not much at all. We do see, though, that this is a global phenomenon. So it doesn't matter what country you're in, you're going to have aspects of your population purchasing from the dark web. What you see here, I'll just draw attention to us in the UK, about 25% of drug users say that they have acquired drugs via the dark web. One good reason for first world type countries to fall prey to this environment is that we have well-functioning mail systems and post systems. So that's going to be my delivery and my carrier. So I order, stuff shows up in the mail, and the reliability of those services actually facilitate the operation of the dark web and this dissemination of drugs. And the fact that a lot of these countries actually have no seizure or no search rules around it, like the US says, like actually in general, you cannot open other people's mail, just adds another layer of protection to this trade. And to make things even better, it keeps growing, right? I said like it was growing 600% year over year. Here specifically within individual countries, you can see UK happily leaving the charge, or England specifically, they divided on this graph. From 2019, England leading the charge in terms of growth rate year over year for the drugs. So let's have a look at this environment, right? One thing is that we have to understand, like, if it is that simple, if it's that many people, drug users that are actually purchasing this, and sometimes in large volume, then the barrier to entry is actually not that high. A motivated buyer is going to buy. And I'm going to start at Google, right? So if you just Google, hey, give me the address of a good black market, you're going to get answers. Now, the first one is probably not going to be the best one, right? Like you might get some wrong links and so on, but invariably, after you try a few options, you're going to land somewhere like this. Now, this is not going to be on the same browser that you're using before. As Mark described, you need specialized browsers to kind of navigate and get into here. But generally, you are going to land here using the browser. You're going to enter an email, a fake email. You're going to create an account, and boom, here you are. Lots of interesting things about the creation and combination of assets within this website. One thing that and just, I'll mention it again here, but this is a dead website. Dream was one of the longest running markets that has since collapsed. So this would be like what the address looks like, ending in the onion address. These are all dead addresses. Nothing that you see here exists anymore. As I mentioned, I'm just studying these dead markets. It's showing you dead markets because it's the ethical safe thing to do. What you do have is essentially a dark mirror of stuff that we know and we see every day, right? Like this looks a lot like a stripped down version of your Amazon page, right? You can search and you can filter out exactly what you want. Here you can see this is an international market. So, and because of the dark web transaction, it's run on Bitcoin, but it's given you the exchange rates for all of Bitcoin. So you can calculate for your local currency what that looks like. And then you just go through a search process, finding things. You can look at the number of pages of products being offered, right? Like we're in the 4,500 here plus pages of different products that are being offered in all sorts of quantities. And it's not just drugs and paraphernalia, but the number of services being offered, the number of digital goods, stolen data, all of that stuff. One of the first things that comes out of this is, and what motivates my study is, the reason the crime here is happening, it's business, right? It's for profit. Everything done here is it's a for-profit motivation, and there's very little other outside of that. So business theory and business understanding and financial logics start playing a big role into the decision-making of criminals in this environment, with very slight variations to maintain their privacy and so on. If I click into one of these products, I'll see something very familiar again, although with some additional fun things. Like I have a star rating for this vendor who's had over 1,000 transactions, or exactly 1,000 transactions and ratings. He has a nearly 5-star rating, and shipping worldwide, especially Europe, ships from Germany. This is one of those silly little things that we can't necessarily verify that this individual was based in Germany. But, in terms of leaving digital fingerprints, this is one of those like silly little stupid things that people do, even in the dark web, just saying in communication, the more they speak, the more they communicate, the more of these traces and information they have for law enforcement to make a case against this vendor into the future. But here you go. You can buy 2.5 kilograms of speed and have that shipped to you. And the service, apparently, it's quite good. And if you look at their review says, yeah, like this was a perfect transaction. I received it in France in only 2 days. And you have all sorts of, crazy stuff that goes along with it. And you can say it's trustworthy or not. And they're maintaining this reputation in the dark web over time. They also have forums, which I'm going to leverage in my study to understand, and they talk. They have advertising in here. They run promotions. All of that plays a role. Now, just to make things a little bit worse and break some more hearts here, it's not just drugs. There have been very successful listings on exact results for football matches in Europe, largely in Italy. So if you were wondering if some matches were fixed, I am sorry, apparently they were. You can buy drugs, but you can also then buy weapons. This long dead armory was run by US military personnel who would ship anything that was available within US bases worldwide. They would just steal stock and ship it in the dark web. We also have assassination markets, which, delightful. This is a case here with Ben Bernanke, who was chairman of Federal Reserve for the United States. One of the scariest things that I've ever encountered, because it started early on. You can see the deposits, and each thing that you see here on the screen is a deposit and a payment being made, adding to the pool for this kill order, increasing the motivation for somebody to accept the contract. And what you had here is very early on, Bitcoin was not worth very much. And eventually Bitcoin went from like $20 a Bitcoin to 30,000 or 5,000 or 10,000 a Bitcoin. And then the value of the contract exploded. And at that point, this page was taken down, probably as a scam, but it was done. You can imagine the sudden risk of the value of the contract exploding, the number of people that would be willing to accept this contract would go much higher, right? So to enter the dark web is not necessarily just through the VPN. There was a slight question here. No, VPN is a layer that people use because it creates one layer of protection. But on top of that, you would use the Tor network, which is the onion router. So you probably use both. One masks kind of where you start and where you exist and gives one layer of protection. And the Tor mixes your signal to make sure that it's really, really difficult to kind of access and pin you as to where you're coming from. The next bit is more the upsetting one. Things that are not supposed to exist. Before we get to that, even in digital crime, we talked a little bit in a previous discussion about the NHS. They were attacked by malware, the Petya, not Petya. That was in the dark web, that was leaked. It was actually run as a promotion. They gave that away to criminals so they would buy other things that they stole from the NSA. So the whole thing with our systems in the UK being locked down was a promotion in the dark web. This one was the first thing that I saw, which is this auction of a girl, and that kind of like messed with me a lot. But I have to say one thing is that this is almost certainly not true because her starting bid is at $150,000. And then looking through criminal marketplaces for humans, this is the sort of conversation that we have. Here's from my hometown. Somebody asking if they can buy little girls or teens, preteens in Oxford, and they say yes they can, and the price is actually $2,700. So human life is unfortunately not that expensive. This apparently is connected to some pornography industry, promo materials, but it led me to this chain of questioning, and this is from a true cybercrime kind of environment, and the values are much worse, right? So it makes you feel a little worse about the human condition. So the question then is, what power do we have? What can we do? And what can kind of my theory do to help, right? The thing is, we have quite a little bit of thinking in terms of counterfeit goods, stopping digital piracy. That has been really big in industry from early zeros, 2000s in terms of film and music. So we understand a little bit about that exchange, but black market itself has not been deeply understood, other than some sociologists saying that it's harm reducing because you don't have gang violence. Although with those trafficked individuals, I tend to disagree. The way that I study most things tends to be via social networks. I'm going to leverage the data in that environment from those conversations to understand who's talking to whom. And this is purely conversation, not transactional information, because I didn't hack into them and get access to that, but just observing the forums and conversations, who had the opportunity to talk. And then I just match essentially over a long-standing correlation of creating these relationships of this individual actually talks to all of these different individuals, and to start mapping the environment. And then I wanted to contrast this network with others and say, okay, is there anything particularly different about this one? And then is there anything about the structure that I can attack? This is the marketplace. So is there anything about this marketplace structure that I can disrupt to make sure that it's less effective, that I can disrupt it so it cannot survive? So what I did here was I crawled and scraped one particular black market, darknet market for a year. And then I'm going to compare it to Amazon and eBay. Both of those happening on a separate forum, a lot of them on Reddit forums. And I'm going to look at those communities and say, does the human interaction in the black market match and mirror the other one? And then what do I know about each one, and how can I develop tools to counter the black market? This is what we get. So each dot is one individual. Each line then is a relationship between individuals. Now, what I'll tell you here from experience is these markets are very representative of normal human interactions because it has this unevenness and splotchiness. You might recognize that from things like birds of a feather flock together, called homophily in sociology. People that are alike tend to group up and stay together. Really popular tends to hang out with other really popular people. And even this weird little parachute on the top here is somebody would call an influencer, right? Somebody here that is really popular and has a certain level of audience. Here, with the same number of people across of these, the black market is condensed. It's all stuck together, and it's all floating around this orb of more highly interconnected individuals and a really compact group there. And what this is forming is more of like a hub and spoke star network, where you have a few very central individuals and a bunch of them in the periphery. Now, this is super weird because humans don't do this normally. Humans do the other things normal. So there's something about this that is on purpose, right? And then the question is like, is it a random? Is it not? We tested it and it's not random. This is actually structurally different. There are numbers that are associated with it, but I'll highlight just one just for super fun. Here's called the diameter. You will recognize the number 7 here and 5. And if you ever played any game where it's like 6 degrees of separation or like 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon, like if I send a letter from me to the Queen, how many people would I have to go to make sure that the letter would get to the Queen? On average, on a human network, that'd be 6 steps. It's just a weird quirk of how interactions work. And you can see here that these two networks created somewhere near 6 degrees of separation. The black market has 2. So from any one individual, I can get to another individual just by going through one intermediary. Now, that is huge, right? One thing that we see is the other marketplaces are these separate communities, all disjointed. Even though they're all part of the same platform, there's too many communities. This one is a singular community. It's one, you cannot tell one individual apart from another. That makes them very, very private, right? So it's very, very hard for you to distinguish one individual from another because of this positioning. They're all essentially in the periphery unless they're in the center. That also makes search, and search being a marketing term here, which is the discovery of a new product or getting new information. You just have to ask one individual, right? Which is very, very interesting. So they are more private, they are more efficient, more effective marketplaces in terms of structure than our normal human marketplaces. Now, that also gives them a plasticity and an ability to survive. Let me say we're going to play cops here for a second. And not that I have a lot of experience with it, but let's arrest one of those people at random. Odds are you're going to arrest one of the people on the edge because the vast majority of them are in the periphery. And the game that I'm going to play is I'm going to ask this person who they know and who's in charge, right? Give me the bigger fish. And the only name they're going to have with most likelihood, the greatest likelihood is they're going to give that same name in the middle. So the greatest likelihood is if you take any one member at random is that they're all going to point towards the same person in the middle, regardless of who you grab, because that one person is the center of the star, the hub of this hub and spoke. Now that is really weird, right? Because if you lose people at random, you don't lose the market. But if you lose that person in the middle, you lost the marketplace. It doesn't function anymore because nobody is connected to anybody else. So why would a criminal organization or a criminal market set up and give themselves such a both resilient but brittle perspective and structure? That would be so easy. Like all I have to do is ask one person who's in charge, grab that person, remove them, throw them out, and the market goes away. Well, it's because they allows them to reform the market then in about a half an hour. If you remove the central person, we've observed that quite a few times, the removal of the central person allows the market to reform by just providing one more person back in the middle, because the money and the goods are on the periphery, on the side, and they never get compromised. So as long as the center is removable and replaced with somebody else, that is precisely who I want you to arrest. So it's a bit of a by design flaw that can be exploited, which is then used for my benefit, which also makes them more effective, more efficient. Interesting, right? So there's this, this idea then is that their recovery, as I put here, is institutionalized, right? So what I want to suggest, I'll go a little bit slower through this part, through the financial logic, is what if this part of failing is just part of the plan, right? What if I intended to fail all along? This is unusual because in business, our main assumption is that businesses want to survive, right? At the bare minimum, your company wants to exist forever. And then we operate from that point, right? How do I survive? How do I go? What if these guys just ignore that and says like, how do I fail successfully and profitably? So here's what I started to look at. I looked at the financial incentive of these black markets, and some very weird things started to pop up, right? The way they work, because there's no trust, is largely through a system of escrow, right? So if I'm going to buy drugs from you, I would send money towards a broker, which is the marketplace, and the marketplace holds it. And the marketplace then sends a communication to the vendor who has the drugs and says, we have the money on hand, ship. Once we have shipment confirmation and delivery confirmation that everything was received and is okay, we will release the funds to you minus a fee for the service, right? And as long as people believe and trust this honest middleman, then the system works fairly well. And there's different values for the fee that they charge for this middleman service, and so on. And the normal behavior tends to be that people slowly interact with the marketplace. So they might make a 10-pound purchase before making a 10,000-pound purchase, just to see how often they can, try the trust and build this before they're burned too heavily with this. And all of this is held within the market, and they get a fee. Now, here's an example of fee structures for all of them, for a number of markets that I've been able to collect data on. Now, we have everything from 0 fees, like Majestic Garden here of Minerva, to at most 10% fees from Point Touchhub. Now, this is strange, because if I was to set up an honest shop and sell it on eBay, right, I would have to pay eBay something like 25%. Why is it so cheap for me to sell drugs? Now, it's very weird that there's such a low barrier to the transactions. And a lot of it probably has to do with the lack of trust in the environment, is that I can't charge you very much for this, otherwise you wouldn't sell on my platform, right? I'm competing at any given time with 10 other marketplaces. But the question then is, why would you then give your money then to this criminal, right? You have a criminal organization that is the in-between person, and is it worth for that individual to be honest? And the question is, if I'm holding your money on escrow, is it ever opportune for me to just steal that money, right? In the dark web, they call it scamming the market, which is you close the marketplace and you keep all the money that you're holding in escrow. I'll give you a little bit of, I try to keep the mathematics to a minimum and the finance to a minimum, but just to build some quick intuition. This is a formula from finance, which is the net present value. So the total sum of all values of all the money that I'm going to make today. So what's my investment? What's my company worth? Here, what I have is, it's a function of my fee, how much I charge, times the deposit. Like, you gave me money, I took a fee from it. So this is my profit divided by my risk minus some growth rate, right? So I want this to be very large. Now, if I'm a criminal, if the total sum that I'm always going to make must be larger than the money that I'm holding on hand. Because if I'm ever, like, imagine that, like, the most I'll make working all of my life is £2. But to make those £2 in the entirety of my life, I have to hold £100, and I'm a criminal. Why would I keep working for those, £2 for a total lifetime of work? Why wouldn't I just run away with your 100? And that's pretty much what happens. For that to be higher than the cash on hand, growth would have to be above risk, which is what we call hypergrowth in economics, meaning that it only becomes stable as long as you have a promise of ever growing amount of money in your hand. And what we get with this, if you start playing with those numbers and tossing numbers around, is that there's an expectation, there's a day at which the market will close, because I'm not maximizing the total profitability, I'm maximizing the amount of deposits that I have. And as soon as I have enough money in my hand, I am going to close and run away with this money. And once we play and organize these numbers and just try to create this example, what you see here is this slope of prediction of closed times as a function of the growth rate and the risk rate. With this sorts of risks between 7% and 53%, so like think of like APR sort of risks, the closing time that we get is it has to close, it will close in less than 1 year on its own. And that goes back to our earlier conversation. We said that we observe that these markets close in about 8 months. So we have this empirical evidence that combines with this model evidence and mathematical and financial rationality evidence that they are not building to exist. What they're building to is to steal. So every single one of these is a scam. The whole plan is like they're going to operate and people are going to buy drugs and a lot of people are going to buy drugs. But at some point, and they all know this at some point, especially the veterans, is that at some point you're going to lose the money that you have in play. So if everybody knows this is a scam, then it's not a scam. What it is, it's just a process. And what I'm calling it here is that this is a perverse lottery. Where a lottery you play and eventually somebody wins. Here is everybody plays and eventually everybody loses, except the person in the center, right? That individual, the market maker. And what we can observe then is this pressure of law enforcement investigation increases the risk exposure, and that then increases the amount of growth required for somebody to stay in the game. So overall, law enforcement does play a role just by virtue of existing and exerting that pressure. Law enforcement accelerates the self-initiated closure of these. But they intended to die as a market all along, which is interesting. And now if I combine that first piece of information of the network, somebody is being very benevolent and taking the very risky position in the center, right? Providing that flaw to be exploited by law enforcement, but also have this then, like, that's suboptimal for an individual here in terms of like, I'm not gonna live forever, but also then high risk. So why would somebody have both suboptimal operation and high risk in this environment? And why would you construct that if that's not the normal human behavior that would just normally occur, right? So this is a non-social community. It's not how eBay, it's not how Amazon works, it's not how co-authors working together, peers, like, no, this is uniquely criminal and unique to this environment. And that structure allows all of this works, right? So the thing is that it is on purpose and it's designed specifically to provide a fall point, a closure point, a failure point to be exploited, to seize investigations, to clear the board and to restart. That is where individuals cash out. The closure is actually them being successful. So even unfortunately, when we say, oh, the market is closed, it's done, actually that is the payday for the person in charge, which invariably, as you probably have guessed, has nothing to do with that individual in the middle. Because if I was smart, if I was in charge, I would not be the one positioning myself to get arrested. That is a rather foolish place for me to put the boss. And we have techniques and mathematics to address that question of who's in charge in a system that is designed to fool me. But just understanding this structure, I think this lens shows that the person that I think is in charge really isn't. Influence is not what it looks like. And this closure, what I call here the smashing with hammer, is not necessarily the best solution because it just plays into this closure loop and creates a payday for somebody and it doesn't go away. And I suggest, at least from a marketing perspective, this demand reduction and defunding of the system is more powerful, making it less effective, less efficient, and slowing that growth so it collapses early and closes early with less profit potential, which then removes the assets from criminals that, you know, go on to use this money to fund elsewhere, other criminal organizations, other parts of the criminal portfolio. So that's how marketing would look at that space. That's the sort of questions and ideas that come to the fore when we consider this. But that's just essentially scratching the surface and getting an idea of what my world looks at this world like. But I'm going to now try to, I know I have at least one more question. If you have more, please go ahead and put them in Q&A, and we'll take it from there. All right, let's see. So I have a question. If I were trying to find out how someone obtained drugs over the dark web, where would you start? So a lot of that is going to be, there's going to, as Mark put out, like all of those activities are going to leave fingerprints, right? So there's behaviors associated with it. And some of them can be very narrow behaviors, such as the frequency with which people log on or the time they log on to a specific service or not. That's actually how the very first black market got closed. It's somebody had always logged on after work, right? So it's at 6 p.m. the market kind of got responses from the owner. For individual, it's likely that you will have to triangulate because there's a lot of not illegal activities that add up to questionable behaviors. Right, so did somebody buy cryptocurrency? They probably, just buying cryptocurrency does not mean that you purchase drugs. That's, a lot of people buy cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin or Monero or et cetera as an investment. But so that doesn't imply drugs, but drugs require this investment. So you have to have that asset to transact. So that needs to exist. If it doesn't exist, then you probably didn't have that issue. If they have Tor, well, you need Tor to get onto the dark web, but having Tor does not mean that you're a criminal or that you bought drugs. I have Tor on the machine here to my left. So it's like this ongoing combination and addition of things that says, okay, I suspect that you bought drugs on the dark web. I can see here that you have Tor. I see that you bought this, and maybe I can see that your money you bought it and then spent it. So it's like some of those behaviors that would add up to that, combine to more of that. A lot of people ship items to not their residence. That would be the most prudent thing, right? Like, so you don't ship it to, if you buy cocaine, you don't ship it to your house, or you don't ship to the neighbor. Sometimes like they ship to neighbors and the neighbors bring it over as like, oh, that's misdelivered. Here's a mistake. Here's your package. Or a PO box or things like that. So it's like ultimately, I don't think there's a silver bullet to your question, Martin, that like, what item do I look at to find who bought drugs on the dark web? But the sum of all of these behaviors start making things quite questionable. And I hope that's a good enough kind of, perhaps unsatisfactory resolution to that, but at least a line that you can pursue.
Thank you for that. I realized that that was perfect timing actually, Felipe, because we are literally at time. And I found that fascinating all over again. Thank you to both speakers, Mark and Felipe. It was really lovely of both of you to donate your time, but also to give us an interesting tour of things that we see and don't really understand. Just to close, a recording of this webinar will be found on our RSM Live websites within the next 48 hours, along with other webinars in this series and from across the RSM. For access to additional digital learning resources, e-journals, e-books, and medical databases, please consider becoming a member of the RSM. And there will be a survey that we would appreciate you completing with feedback on this event. Thank you very much and good evening.